Thank you, Peter. I was just telling Jerry that I'm so happy to be here for many reasons. One of the many reasons, and I feel like as I was researching AERO over the past few years, this is my first time at AERO, one of the things that I was a little bit like, wow, they don't have this on the website, and good, Jerry's right there. So I think going forward, one of the primary things that needs to be on the website is that AERO folks give like the best hugs. Like the hug game is like level 10. So that felt really good. Thank you for everyone who's hugged me. I'm really, really happy to be here. It's my first time, and the Alliance for Self-Directed Education is a big part of why, so I have to give a shout out to my people. Peter Gray and Danielle, who I'm looking at right here. Gina, I don't know whether Gina Riley is here. All of the members of the Alliance, really, we're doing work that is changing the world, but also changing us. And I'm just almost like in this state of overwhelm in a very beautiful way about what's going on and the connections that are being made. And this feels like an extension of that. So thank you for waking up early to come listen to me. And one of the things that I love about spaces like this is that most people sitting in a room like this, coming to a conference like this, have already crossed that hurdle of seeing learning as something that happens from one person passing it on to a herd of usually younger people, right? Like we get that learning is connected to so many different things, and that it's one aspect of like this holistic approach to being and living, right? Like nobody here is like, what, right? Okay, so we know that. And what's great about that is it means that we can expand the conversation. We can talk not just about children and not just about education, but we can talk about raising free people. We can talk about contributing to the type of socially just, love-centered, community-centered type of world that people like you and I long for. And we don't just long for it, we work for it. And we come to places like this to figure out how we can actually do it. So this means that we can talk about that in that space, in this space. And we can talk about also some of the obstacles to creating that type of world. And we can talk about being more deliberate in the ways that we participate in solutions to that, which has been happening a lot here. And I like to summarize a lot of what are some of the obstacles that we have. I see them as forms of oppression, right? They oppress people, they oppress dreams, all of these different things. So I want to talk today about some of the ways that we participate in oppression and also some of the solutions to it. And so because children, parenting, caregiving, education is wrapped up in all of that, I want to talk today about the connection between our egos and our children. I want to talk about some of the ways that we either suppress or support people. I want to talk about some of the obstacles to that once again and our participation in that. And I'm going to be really candid about some of my stumbling blocks along the way. I'm a writer first and foremost, so I'm just going to be sharing some of the thoughts that I've put into writing around forms of oppression and my participation in that oppression, both involuntarily as a Black person, as a woman, as an immigrant, and also voluntarily as a fear-based parent. So, of course, in all of that, I want to feel through strategies for solutions to that. I want to shift from oppression and ego and fear-based living into something far more liberatory, far more socially just, and I think that is self-directed education. Yes, yes, and feel free to woo and yeah, I don't mind that, okay? I grew up in a, see? Yes, good stuff. So, my peoples. So yeah, for me, that is self-directed education. And my family, we've experienced self-directed education specifically through unschooling. And many of us here probably recognize, but just to be clear, unschooling is one type of self-directed education. Beautifully, SDE shows up in multiple forms. I happen to really identify with unschooling. And one of the things that's really interesting about unschooling is that it starts out being about education, Most of us who happen upon self-directed education, the broader spectrum, or unschooling, it's a way to get out of something that isn't working or to avoid it altogether if you're a lifelong unschooler. It starts out being about that. How can I help my child to take charge of their learning, or how can I help my students to take charge of their learning? So you start there, but it starts out about education and ends up being about sovereignty. Like, the more time you spend with children not trying to control them, the more you recognize all the spaces where you are trying to control, because then you have to face it, you know. And the more you do that, you recognize that it really isn't just about education, it's about liberation. It's about the idea that if the young people around me were free to define and design what life looked like for them, what would my role in that be? And then we start to look at the ways that we've played that role before, and how that was much more about fear and control and not necessarily about education. So that's what I want to dive into. So I want to share what I've written about unschooling as a means of liberation, and I also want to talk a little bit about liberation language. And I decided to include Jamaican Patois in here. Do we have any Jamaicans in the room? I know I met one, but I don't know if she's here. You have one? All right, so you're going to learn some Patois today. We're going to do a little bit of teaching as well. A part of my daily practice, much of my daily practice of raising free people always brings me back to memories of my own childhood. And I can clearly see the ways that I was treated as a child and the things that moved me as a child. I see how they influence who and how I am today now, and the way that I deal with people, all of my relationships now. I remember being in grade 3, you know, so this is in St. Andrew, Jamaica. I'm 8 years old, and I'm sitting in a sea of little brown girls and boys, and we have on our yellow blouse and our green tunic and our black or brown socks and our black or brown shoes. And if you were fancy, your socks had like frill where it folded around, and I was fancy. So when you envision it, please envision my socks with the frill. That was important. And you had ribbons that matched your tunic. I mean, it was, you know, it was kind of fancy. So I remember sitting in my classroom one day, and our teacher, and we didn't call them by name. If it was a woman, we called her Miss. If it was a male, we said Sir. So I remember one day, Miss got with the teacher who was right behind us, and they started moving the chalkboard that separated our grade 3 class from the other grade 3 class. So if you envision a row of like 4 grade 3 classes. And she moved the board. And everybody in the class like, what's going on? Because it wasn't the end of school, and usually the board would only be moved if we were gonna watch like karate movies towards the end of the year, which interestingly in Jamaica, like we watched a lot of karate movies as kids. So I was like, all right, karate. And we said Karachi, which is a city in where? Pakistan? Is that where it is? Well, we said Karachi, so we weren't watching Karachi, and it wasn't the end of the year, so what was going on? So as it turns out, we were gonna be watching a performance on TV. So we're very excited, and we did as we were told. You put your finger on your mouth, and you put it, you know, sit up properly and behave yourself, and we did all the things so we could get our treat of watching TV. So we were not just gonna watch TV, we were gonna watch a performance by Miss Lou. Has anyone ever heard of Miss Lou? Oh, I get to give y'all Miss Lou? Okay, so Miss Lou, she passed in July of 2006, but she was and is a Jamaican cultural icon. She focused on language, you know, Jamaican Patois in particular, and she celebrated it. So we were gonna watch Miss Lou. Her name is actually the Right Honorable Dr. Louise Bennett Coverley, if you want to Google her, if you want to Google her, if you want to Google her. Dr. Louise Bennett Coverley, but we knew her as Miss Lou. And Miss Lou, it's not a lot of us here, so I can move. So she always had, can y'all hear me? So she always was dressed in full traditional Afro-Caribbean attire. So she had these bandana skirts. We also call them dinkimini. She had a dinkimini skirt, and then she had a head wrap that matched our dinkimini skirt, and she had the ruffle shirt. And I like to say that she brought the Caribbean breeze with her wherever she went, because she didn't just walk into a room, she'd walk, you know, and she had the skirt like this. And it felt like that. When you saw her, your body started to move like that too. And she wasn't necessarily like this great singer. She was a wonderful poet. A lot of her poetry is featured all over the world in international studies around, the value of poetry and culture. And so she didn't have this great singing voice, but she could tell a story like nobody else. She was like a master griot. And little things like going to the market, a very typical thing. You had people who came from the country into the town to sell their food in the market, and she would just sing the basic songs about, the market, and you just felt like you were there. So we were really excited. So one of the things that I loved about her, and one of the things that stuck out for me, is that she spoke Patois. She spoke Jamaican Patois, the broken English that we weren't allowed to speak. And we were here sitting in our nice and decent classroom with our nice and decent teacher in our nice and decent green tunic and yellow blouse. And there was this woman speaking Jamaican Patois. And my teacher was letting her. And that really struck me. I remember it very vividly because I kept looking over, wondering if they would realize that it was Miss Lou and that she could influence us, and then we might talk Patois, So that was really interesting to me. And she wasn't just speaking it. Miss Lou was talking about embracing Patois. She widened her mouth and wrinkled her nose the way Jamaican Patois, because you can't speak Jamaican Patois like this. It's very difficult to keep your mouth this way. You have to talk so. You have to talk so, you have to move and go like this. So she had all of that down, the nose wrinkled, the widening of the lips, all of that. And I just remember being just like, I felt mesmerized by how she really just embraced this thing. And she taught us that Patois was our people's way of creating shared meaning and co-creating community. So Patois, especially before Miss Lou came around and did her work, was not embraced by Jamaican society. And here's an excerpt from a body of work by Ruby Madden entitled The History and Culture Aspects of Jamaican Patois. Sometimes called a bastardization of English, Jamaican Patois is in fact a linguistic system separate from English with distinguishing factors in its loose structure, popularity, and roots in slavery. Patois comes from French, the French origin meaning rough speech, and usually carries a negative connotation. It's called also African English, the language of the Jamaican people, and it began to develop in the 1600s in Jamaica with the slave trade. The slaves were divided into groups deliberately without a common language to prevent revolt. The slaves were divided into groups deliberately without a common language to prevent revolt. Sound familiar? The slaves began to learn Pidgin in order to communicate with each other and their masters. The children grew up in this life, learned Pidgin from their parents as their first language, and it evolved from Pidgin into Creole. Creole, another term for Patois, is created all over the world as a natural way that language evolves. They are not primitive, but reveal the state of mind of the people in society. During slavery and plantation days, as well as after emancipation, there were many variations of Patois being spoken. These languages show what develops when widely different backgrounds are forced together and have to communicate. End of quote. So this is what made Miss Lou such a revolutionary. She saw right past that overwhelming rejection of the validity of our language creation. She celebrated it, and she turned it into courses of study at the University of the West Indies, where she taught folklore and drama. She reimagined Jamaican theater with some other actors and actresses, and they took it from basically this like watered down version of British theater into something that very much embraced our culture as well. So she was really doing work that freed us to express ourselves without essentially just trying to mimic what we knew as authority. And she was doing this in a time where the proper places and people seemed to love Miss Lou, but they definitely didn't share her politics. They didn't share her appreciation for our culture anywhere but in writing that was made to entertain. They put the British-centered way of speaking and performing poise above our Africanesque way of walking and talking and taking up space, right? And that's what we were taught. And she reached me. She reached 8-year-old me. She spoke to me in 1985 when I was sitting down in my classroom with my green uniform and my yellow blouse. And her work still resonates with me today as I develop my practice for seeing right past the overwhelming rejection of our human right to self-determine, starting at childhood. So through our self-directed education practice, we are developing shared meaning. We are committed to finding ways to treat each other with regard and respect and humanity, even when we can't find a shared meaning and common ground. And Ms. Lou had such a level of respect and deep value for the creation of shared meaning and self-expression and community creation, which are a lot of aspects of self-directed education as well. She was helping Jamaicans at home and abroad to remember and to value what we created and the communities that it helped to build. She did it anywhere people would listen. She did it in Patois. And Ms. Lou, in that work, was helping us to decolonize our minds and our beliefs and our studies. And I think that one of the most obvious places, maybe even the most low-hanging fruit in the work of decolonizing our minds, is in our relationships with children. Because children are the one group that all other social groups have power over, truly. So this is why Ms. Lou and her appreciation of Patois is so important, as I share with you here today. Because I think that parenting and facilitating learning as an educator, these sort of things, I think done mindfully is its own Patois. This is where we come with our language and our learned customs and context as adults, and children also come with their own context, in their own way. And when we come together to communicate and connect, when we get in a rhythm, that is our Patois co-creation. So the one thing about it is that we're creating a Patois, but we're not forced to communicate the way that enslaved people developed their Patois out of that dire need. No, we get to do it from a more empowered space. We get to deliberately co-create language as a means of empowerment, and we get to deliberately co-create a language that makes sense for the type of relationships that we want to have with children, and the type of world, once again, that people like you and I come to these sorts of spaces to see how we can be a part of creating and nurturing. So we're deliberately developing that language to understand each other outside of the context of other people. Because a lot of parenting and adulting really is viewed through the lens of like how the children around us are. And so that Patois creation allows us to be considering more so ourselves and the child, and not all of those other factors in terms of how other people see them. So coercion and regurgitation and judgment through testing, we get to sit outside of those things and say, okay, what would it look like if we're co-creating this language, if we're developing this Patois together? And in that practice, in that development, we can learn to understand each other outside of that context. And so that practice for me is something that as we continue to unschool, it's allowing myself and Chris to really be our whole selves in our relationships with Marley and Sage, our daughters. And then equally important, they get to bring their whole selves to their relationships with us and everybody else. And that's what I want. I want to continually co-create language and shared meaning and understanding with anybody, but particularly with and for young people. And I want to understand the blend of influences and expressions that are creating them in front of me. And I want to be able to listen outside of my own ego without centering what I'm most afraid of. So sometimes I know I'm on the right path to nurturing that type of relationship, and other times I miss the mark completely. And I'm going to tell you about both of those times. But because I want to look good, here's an example of a time when I was able to do it properly. Okay, so so much of the work that I do is inspired by a conversation that I've had with either Marley or Sage. And sometimes the conversation is light and lovely. We're talking about music or manga or travel or, fun stuff. And other times it's centered on not so fun stuff, and sometimes even tragedy. And this time it was about tragedy, and the tragedy was the murder of Alton Stirling. And Alton Stirling was the 37-year-old black man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who was publicly lynched, gunned down by police right after Independence Day last year. So of course, when these lynchings happen, we all, or I hope, that we all check in with each other and we check in with ourselves. You know, I tend to just go in the bathroom and have my first cry and process, because those sort of experiences don't just affect you, they affect your relationships with other people. So sometimes I may be angry, and that anger might come out, you know, I might take it out essentially on somebody else because I haven't made the time to process my feelings. And also to check in with the people around me to see whether they are okay, whether they are safe, these sort of things. And we have, unfortunately, lots and lots of practice doing that. So this time, Marley, our oldest, she's 13 now, this was last year, I checked in with her, and I was really disturbed by her response. It felt like apathy. She shrugged it off. Mom, seriously? This happens all the time. America hates black people. Like, I looked at history stuff. This has been happening forever. Why are we talking about this again? She just shrugged it off. And of course, my immediate response was to try to fix her, to try to fix that feeling. What are you saying? Oh my God, she's desensitized. What did we do wrong? Chris, oh my God. You know, I went through that space. And, you know, I had to sit with it. I really had to sit with it, but what I didn't do is say anything to her about it. I allowed her, because she has the right, to express her feelings, and I didn't act on my desire to try to fix her feelings. Even though in the moment it didn't feel like I was going to try to fix her feelings, it felt like I was going to try to give her context and clarity and understanding, and, you know, all of the things that we really believe that we're doing when really we're just trying to fix something that we want to change. So instead of doing that, through my unschooling practice, I've hit that brick wall several times, enough times to recognize that I needed to be a witness and not a solver in this environment. And so that's what I did. You know, I touched her, you know, and told her she was safe. I wasn't sure whether that even mattered or whether that was relevant. And mostly I just listened. And when she's like, are we done? You know, after a few minutes, and I was like, yep. You know, and poor Chris, that's who I had to get all of that out on and talk to for 8,000 minutes about all of my feelings around it. So, and I'm glad that I did that, because what happened was, and I actually wrote about this, I write for a number of sites, including everydayfeminism.com, and if, you know, I detail that dialogue if anybody is interested in that, but essentially, to synthesize that, I felt like I was rewarded for being a witness, because a couple of days later, she came back to me about it. And then she told me where she really was. And she said, I processed through writing. She gets that from her mama. I processed through writing, and if I wrote about it and shared it online, the next thing you know, police could be at our door targeting us too. And that would be my fault. I'd put my whole family in danger. Yeah. So had I made the assumption that her attitude was the problem, that she couldn't go around saying things like that, and, you know, that it would sound crazy to folks, and who might she grow up to become if she was desensitized to violence and aspects of her identity, you know, if I'd focused on that, then I'd be looking right past her feelings and over to how it might look or sound to someone else, even if that someone else was just me. So my ego would now be in the mix with like a cape on and a bodysuit, and my ego is like swole. My ego is like 7'2" and like huge. And oftentimes it's kind of like, you know, it jumps right in front of me, and sometimes I let it, right? But this was one of the times that I didn't. You know, ego wasn't in the mix in this case, taking priority over the opportunity to listen and to be there and maybe even to understand, you know? So had I not been a witness, had I not questioned my need to control her feelings, I would have missed the opportunity to see that what looked like apathy was actually fear. Fear for her family's safety, fear of retribution from white policemen and the anti-black justice system that backs it, you know, and backs them. So, and because I chose to witness and not to use it as an opportunity to fix her, then, or to change her mind, we now have several conversations, often initiated by Marley, around navigating blackness and fear while owning your voice and speaking your truth. And of course, this spills over into our whole family and into other conversations as well. And I feel like that's very much a reward for my practice of being willing to be a witness and not to fix her. So she has some level of context now, and we can talk about these things, and she can use these skills in her life, and it's not like an argument. It didn't turn out to be an argument between her and mom, but instead these are skills that she can now apply to other things as she practices expressing herself and understanding her emotions and working through all of that with support and without judgment. So she is developing language and practice for handling these things from a healthy space. And Chris and I are learning Marley and learning Sage, and together we're speaking our patois. We're developing our language. And language, communication, all of that, it's a full body effort. Miss Lou knew that, right? She embodied breeze when she came through. And language is important in that way. It's a full body effort. The words you hear, the things you see, those are all a part of more, right? It's a part of how we develop effective communication. And let me tell it, it's the primary way to develop effective communication. And it's to look at the purpose and the function of language. That's one of the ways that I find useful in developing that form of communication. In other words, what do we want out of communication? If it's to be right, then that's easy. Just do what we normally do the default and build up your ego and put it in the mix. But if it's understanding, if what you want out of communication is understanding, then it's helpful, I think, to educate ourselves on the function of language. Because trust, and Jonathan kind of alluded to that a little bit there, that there's a deliberate aspect, the same way that the enslaved people were separated in that way so that, to prevent revolt. The things and the people and entities that thrive off of suppression, those systems know the function and critical importance of language and its context as part of the intentional creation or sustaining of culture and of a sense of belonging. This is, for example, why indigenous children in the US were taken from their families in the American Indian boarding schools in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. Children are among the most vulnerable and also the most important to the furthering of culture. So they took these children and forced them to speak English, forced them to abandon their culture, their identity. They were punished if they spoke their mother tongues. So language matters. How we speak to people, how we speak to ourselves, how we envision language, that matters. And as we shift from the old model, the old paradigm of relating to children, we will need new language. We'll need to develop tools and habits in support of this shift towards liberation in practice, not just in theory, not just in study. And because for a lot of us, this SDE work feels newer, right, as within the past like 20 or 30 years, not all of us, but for many of us, then it can be really challenging to consider language. So in this paradigm where new language is developed by necessity, we can either let that language develop and let it emerge, and we can participate mindfully in its emergence through a partnership mentality with children, or we can try to force them to speak our language. We can try to colonize them into something we might understand, mold them into something that is more convenient for us. We can use language to learn how to live in more liberatory relationships with children. And we can start, again, by understanding the function and the purpose of language. And the function of language includes 5 primary things: communication, the expression of identity, play, imaginative expression, and emotional release. And when we look at the ways that the children we love are either free to be themselves or held back in these abilities to communicate, to define and express their identity as it forms, to play, to express their imaginations and their ability to process their emotions, that's how we can begin to examine our participation in language building and assess whether we're involved in building it or if we're tearing it down or preventing it from happening effectively. So unschooling is so much about that mindful interaction, and really self-directed education overall is about that mindful interaction and the valuing of human rights. It isn't just about education, it's the valuing of human rights. And it allows us the space to shift back towards that partner mode when we see ourselves veering off into that presenter mode, when we go from guide and safe space to colonizer. So here's an example of a time that my ego had just worked out and just won that day. So we're driving home after picking up the girls from a weekend slumber party. They spent 2 days there actually. And it turns out that Sage hadn't eaten much of anything at all that weekend. And she's always been a sporadic eater, and I've recently learned about Ayurveda. Anybody familiar with Ayurvedic principles? So, okay, cool. You don't need to tell me, like, I'm just finding this out. It's so interesting. So your, the composition, that make up your constitution, actually, the term for it is your dosha. So like all of the things that comprise who and how you are, including how you tend to eat, how much sleep you need, what your body frame tends to be like, if your hair tends to be thick or thin, all of those things are tied to your Ayurvedic, your composition, your dosha. And I'm learning now that Sage has what's called a vata dosha, and folks with vata doshas as adults tend to fast. That's like a normal part of that dosha, is that they will sometimes fast for a few days. It's an intuitive thing that happens. I didn't know that. I was just like, girl, eat. That's where my mind always was. And so, we were talking after we picked them up. We're in the car talking. The four of us were in the car. We're having a conversation about it. Not an argument at all. I'm just like, Sage, what did you eat? Took a couple of bites of this. Honey, you need to eat. And we went into, we talk about all of the things from the nutritional components, and also if you ignore what your body needs, what can happen in that space. So we're having these conversations, and Marley is engaged. And at one point, for me, it seemed like she was no longer focused on having the dialogue. It was like she was just proving her point. And when ego steps in, age is irrelevant, at least my ego. Again, my ego is very well developed. So it's true. So after a while, it just felt like confrontational. It felt like so she said things like, we're being dramatic. Remember that? She's like, you guys, just kind of being a little dramatic, because I feel like it's only been a couple days, and it only takes this amount of time. It takes this amount of time before you actually become dehydrated. And the body can go with this amount of days without food, blah, 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 blah. And she's going in, and then ego was just like, rah! So I just broke it down, and so how the body works, and I just was like spitting knowledge, And of course, I wasn't talking to her, so she wasn't listening. Sage was probably never listening. So, and I just went on, and then Chris is like, touching my knee, he's driving, he's like, Akilah, and I'm like, yes, hold on, please. Yes, and this is what happens when your body, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just fully engaged in that. And so ego was winning. I totally flipped out. And ego was centered, and I was definitely in that presentation mode where I was trying to present these facts that these little people didn't know nothing about, and I was just trying to educate them, and blah, 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 blah. Right, so that's a time where ego won, and unschooling and all of those practices just flew right out the window. So, that's when I was in my presenter model. So I see, in terms of parenting and caregiving, there are 2 modes of parenting. And I know that in psychology, they're like 4, right, Peter? Like 4 modes of parenting. If you come up here and correct me, my ego won't be able to deal with it, so don't. So as far as I know, there are 4 types. And authoritative is the first one, which is do what I say and shut it up, or I'm gonna shut it down. There's authoritarian. Why won't you do what I say? That's in your best interest. Let's talk about it. There's permissive. Do what you want, honey. And then there's uninvolved. Do you, boo? Shrug life, right? What else? So there are 4 of those. So generally there are 4 main styles of parenting, but I think that there are only 2 modes we can be in, and that's either a presenter or partner. And when I say parenting, I don't just mean biologically, I also include educators, because you are parenting, you are nurturing. So please think of that when I say parenting. So you're either a presenter or you're a partner. I think it's that simple. And one of these modes, and I think you guys can figure out which is which, is a healthy part of nourishing a good ecosystem where a patois can flourish. And the other is usually part of an ecosystem. And I got that word ecosystem, I love it. I got it from Austin Kleon, author, dad, cartoonist dude who wrote Steal Like an Artist. Has anybody read that book? Did you like it? So good, right? Yes. Austin Kleon, shout out to Austin. So he wrote Steal Like an Artist, and he said, our world is an ecosystem in which our only real chance at survival as a species is cooperation, community, and care. But it's being led by people who believe in an ecosystem run on competition, power, and self-interest. church. I mean, I had to read that like 50 times. Yes, Austin, totally. So this brought parenting and caregiving to mind for me, because parenting, the style that is expected and celebrated today, is definitely an egocentric process, wouldn't you say? Yeah, very much so. And so we're looking to find out what we believe to be true and best, and then putting those thoughts and beliefs and ideas onto children, whether as parents or educators or village members. We look at how good a job or how bad a job we or someone else is doing as a parent or educator based on how compliant the children in our care are. Bless you. Based on that compliance. So that's how ego-centered we are. When we walk into a space and if someone's child is running around, most people are like, you know, they're looking at them like, what's going on? So your level of regard and even respect in some instances, a big part of that judgment is based on how compliant the children in your care are. And I see a lot of head nodding, so I know y'all know. So what do we do about that? You know, we know that. What do we do about that training? What do we do about that tendency? I say we disrupt it. That's pretty much like my general strategy for things. If I may not know how to solve it, but I totally know how to disrupt it while I figure out how to solve it. So that tends to be my approach. And so that process of acknowledging, disrupting, essentially redesigning ourselves based on what we prefer, what we want to see, and not what's placed on us, I know that as deschooling. That's essentially what I see as deschooling. And when we deschool, we shift from that ego system over to an ecosystem, which means we're seeking a harmonious environment where each of us, parent, educator, child, auntie, uncle, whoever, any human at any stage or any age can be themselves and bring that self to the societies in which they participate. So how do we get comfortable? If we see the need to raise free people, but we have no practice, no language to live this thing that certainly wasn't afforded to us, how do we do that? It wasn't afforded to us at home. It wasn't afforded to us in school. It wasn't afforded to us in our churches, you know, all of the places where we experience a sense of safety. How do we do it? And I say we access it by language. So, but the questions still stand, you know, how do we access, much less maintain, a circle, a community, grow a society where each of us, and particularly the children that we nurture, can be themselves and can bring that authentic self to the societies in which they participate? We do it through language. So if we're developing a new normal together, what does language consist of? Are we willing to commit to co-developing a patois with each child that we nurture? And if we are, I want to propose some of the ways that we might do it. So I like to say that I'm bilingual. I speak oppression by training, and I speak liberation by personal desire and personal conviction. Yes. So together, each of my daughters and I are creating our own patois, our own language that fosters mutual understanding and shared meaning. And when we don't understand each other, we're learning how to use questions, like our little translation dictionaries, so that we can replace anger with opportunity, and so that we don't ditch the ecology for the egology. And one way to support ourselves in the decision to raise free people is to acknowledge that language, whether we're talking verbally or bodily, it can be either oppressive or liberating. And in recognizing that, we can explore our options for steering our boats towards more liberated language and away from the oppressive language that we resort to when we're triggered. Questions can liberate us from our default responses, something as simple as pausing to question. It can liberate us from our default responses, from presenter mode, you know, from presentation parenting, as I like to call it. I say that in my mind when I'm about to try to fix something with the girls. I'm like, I'm presenting. You know, and sometimes it works. And then other times it's like, yes, I am. And then I go on to present, and, you know, then I have to apologize and talk about it later. But that mode, that presenter mode of parenting, it doesn't liberate anybody. It doesn't liberate us, and it certainly doesn't liberate children. So if we don't question what we assume, especially what we assume about children, then we're already assuming that we have the right answer. And that assumption lends itself quite well to that presenter mode, where we say, I don't know what's actually going on, but I know what I know, and I'm going to tell you what I know. You're going to learn this thing. You know, like that's where you go if you don't take the time to pause and ask the question. So we tell them that we have the right answer, we know best, and we use what we've got in our own arsenal without the benefit of that incredibly necessary ingredient that is the needs of the other person that we're trying to communicate with. Now, this tends to make sense adult to adult for most of us, but when it comes to children, especially as parents and educators as well, because educators also love on our babies, you know, like they're their own, in that space, even though we get it adult to adult, when it comes to children, we're like, no, I'm sorry. I'm not in a relationship with this child. I'm trying to raise this child. I'm trying to give them the things that they need to, you know, make their way in the world and that sort of thing. I'm teaching them about life and relationships and all these other things. So if we focus on that, we don't look at the ways that we oppress children. And then on top of that, we act like they're crazy when they clap back. You know, do you know what I mean by clap back? You know? Okay. So when they retaliate, clap back. You know, we act like they're doing something outlandish when they clap back, when this is normal. You know, if you feel trapped, you are going to want to do something about that. So we know what to do if we ask more questions. We say we don't understand this, you know, we say that this new way, this new paradigm, I think we give ourselves too many excuses in this new paradigm for the ways that we still treat children. Because if we asked questions, then I think it would be a lot less mysterious. And if we use the power of witnessing, not just observation, and I won't go into a lot of the differences, but I think that witnessing is more of an active process than even observation, and I use it a lot to combat ego. So if we ask more questions, if our patois development would include a practice of honoring what children say they need, just as much as we honor what we think they need, then I think it would become a lot easier for us, or it has become easier for me. And I'm not trying to say that I get it right all the time. I want to make that real clear in case y'all ever meet Marley or Sage. And I also write very candidly about my experiences in parenting. I say all the time that motherhood raised me, and I'm still being raised today. So I think we'd know what to do if we asked more questions, because parenting is our presentation. It's our big project. We spend most of our time parenting or educating ahead, right past who children are now and right over to who they might become if they can just get it right, and if we can just get it right. You know, if we could just manage to get it right. So we partner with schools if our kids are in schools, or we partner with their education, or we homeschool, or we do all of these other things, but we do them oftentimes under the same formula. Try to feel good about being a parent or educator. Try to make sure your kid knows how to not make you look crazy. You know, that's such a big part of it. Don't make me look crazy. You know, and also to try to help them offer something good to the world. So we have the best intentions, and I get that. Shout out to us and our good intentions. But it's no excuse. We still have to look past that. And you know, in some instances, this parenting presentation mode, our parents did it to us too. You know, it's what we've bought into. And for my family and for many families, unschooling is detox. It's rehab from presentation parenting. And I can speak to this reality as a former child, as a parent, and particularly as a Black parent raising Black people. And I want to talk a little bit about how oppression shapes our lives, and fear, how those things shape our lives in particular. So in the history of people of color in America from the slavery era and later during Jim Crow, which technically ended, but the extensions of that exist and are very powerful. But from that history, many Black parents protected our children by keeping them out of sight. So while white children played freely and climbed trees and sang out loud, our people told our children to stay low, you know, don't speak unless spoken to, don't come out to play unless that white child said you can come out to play, and stay close to where I am just in case. That was the reality. We parented, and we ourselves were parented through a survivalist lens. We were parented, and we ourselves parented through a survivalist lens. So we were like Cecil Gaines in Forrest Whitaker. Forrest Whitaker played that character in The Butler, that 2013 movie. Did anybody see that? Okay, yeah. You've seen everything you've read. We need to share a list. You know, but in The Butler, Forrest Whitaker did a fantastic job portraying that character, and it wasn't just about that character, it really was about a culture that still exists, where it's, be seen when you can help white folks and get out of the way otherwise. And so you stay in the fray. And that hasn't left many of us. It didn't go away the day that certain laws, were no longer legal. It didn't just go away. That imprint is there. And I get why, because how can anything be more important than the safety of children, the most vulnerable among us? So I remember going into banks even and other places where I knew that we'd be the minority and being expected to perform this poise so that we can be viewed as like the good black folks, the non-ghetto black folks. I remember that very much. I remember going into the bank and my mom, she herself would be different. And my then one brother, and I have 3 now, but my then one brother and I, we would, it was just kind of weird. We're coming from Jamaica where most of the people looked like us. Jamaica people are usually surprised. We have Germans, Chinese, Syrians, all of these different types, but primarily you're gonna see, Black African people, descendants of Black African people. And of course we watched a lot of TV, so we knew about all of the others, and there are white people in Jamaica as well, but we didn't have the experience of like performing in a sense for that white gaze. And we started to see how that happened, and we started to see how my mother was doing that as well. And so I knew that it was specific to me as a black child, because in the banks, I saw that the white children could sing out loud and nobody was looking at them or grabbing them back. I saw that they could pick up a lollipop from the, the counter where they keep them, and if they grabbed it and didn't say thank you, somebody might rub their head and call them a little rascal. Whereas if, you did it as a black or brown child, it was a totally different look, it was a totally different experience. I saw that myself. I didn't have to wait until I went to college to study these things to recognize it. I saw that. And so essentially it was this idea of a threat. It wasn't safe for anyone, apparently, if black children preferred not to hide. That was the message. So as an immigrant, my mother taught my brother and me how to perform for that white gaze, frankly. It was important what they thought, maybe sometimes more important than what we thought, because they held positions of power. And this is not something that I blame my mother for, or something that I, think that she should have, I wish that she would have done differently, not at all. Because this is how a woman learned the system. This is a woman who left her 2 young children in Jamaica to make a career for herself as a legal assistant, and she ended up filing for myself and my brother and her 3 siblings and bringing everybody ultimately over to the US. And in all of that, she learned that the white gaze was the one that mattered, and that education was the playbook for the white gaze. And so she made sure that, my brother and I, that we got that education. That was the focal point. And so she wanted us to have those skills. And I remember my podcast is actually called Fare of the Free Child, F-A-R-E. And one of my guests, her name is Elaine Santa Cruz. She's a Chicanx. She actually just finished her doctoral program. She's an unschooling mother who just finished her doctoral program. And she remembers very similar things. We shared a lot of those ideas of like our parents making sure that we knew how to perform for the white gaze and what that meant, and how education was the playbook to do that. So we talked about those sort of judgments, and for Lane, she looked at how, for example, when she walked into the bank with her 3 children, the side conversations and the looks and this idea of like, oh Lord, another Mexican with a bunch of babies and no babies' daddies. And people have said these things sometimes to her, sometimes in conversation she could hear, sometimes in the look. You have so much practice with it that you see when it's happening. So that white gaze is something that becomes centered for a lot of people of color. And so we talk about these things and we say how we're taught to perform this so that white people can see us as civilized. That's the message. So that makes it hard for many of us to imagine something like self-directed education to be anything other than a luxury that's going to only be afforded to the people in power or people of color who manage to get there through, economic status. That's how many people of color view self-directed education. Yeah, so the silencing of our voices and self-expression growing up and historically, it wasn't meant to be a form of oppression. It was meant to ensure our survival. But those sentiments still echo, and today, even though they sometimes look different. This idea of suppression of anything other, both in the communities ourselves and also outside of it. So sometimes it looks exactly the same as it's always looked historically in this country. Police routinely target and murder our children, for example. Other times it looks like making sure that our children know how to mimic whiteness through respectability politics that tell us to speak and dress and socialize in ways that make white people feel comfortable, that make us feel or seem less threatening somehow. Because our children are less likely to be hurt or killed if they're not perceived as threats to white people. And these are the realities that we face, and these are some of the ways that we are groomed both directly, verbal statements directly, and just also through the practices that have become a part of the culture out of a need for survival. And when I say white people, I don't just mean like outwardly racist white people. I mean an entire systemic mentality backed by policies, policing, economic structure, and socialization tactics that center whiteness and vilify and dehumanize blackness. So I always like to bring up that aspect that whether you've personally experienced racism or not, it is still an issue. It's still costing people their freedom and their lives, and it's still costing the people against whom racism is hurled our capacity to imagine that our children can be free in ways that we're not sure that we ourselves have ever experienced. Because the history and this current reality, in some instances, they're one and the same. It's a continuum. It may look different, but there is a continuum there. So this history and this current reality are also a part of why people of color also don't trust shared self-directed education spaces. Because outside of their own homes, because historically, currently, systemically, and consistently, we don't see white people willing to humanize, let alone trust Black and brown children the way that they would trust their own. And that's one of the realities. So these biases become barriers, dangerous, damaging, sometimes deadly barriers that stop us from growing in self-directed education. So it stops us from looking at ways to expand our understanding of each other, increase our awareness of the needs of each other because of these fears. So some, perhaps many people of color, believe that our children should be free to learn too. But first we gotta get free, So, and you can't get free inside a prison. You can't. So unschooling for us is a liberatory practice that empowers communities and families to raise each other and to resolve these generational traumas of attempting to force our dynamic selves into these limiting and inherently racist schooled mindsets. It is not a luxury. People say all the time, particularly for Chris and me, there's this idea that we must have a lot of money because we're digital nomads and we live in different countries and cities and we're unschooling our children, and people are like, they must be balling. Like, Absolutely not. The same sustainability issues a lot of people brought up here, we absolutely face those things as well. And so it is not a luxury to embrace self-directed education. It is risky and it is complicated, and for many of us it is this unpaved path to a form of freedom. And of course, white parents have fear-based parenting mojo too. That's not a black or white thing. Everyone has fears around the safety of their children, and the hopes that we have for our children sometimes are encircled in fear. But it just looks different. And for many white people, those fears won't be centered on anti-black, perfectly normalized violence against your children. So all families endure fears and realities that influence our parenting style, but the tragic norm for families of color are piled on top of those everyday things that we all have. So there are more layers, there's less control, there's less privilege, and there's less protection. And all of those layers, all of those experiences, they either drive us to force our children to perform better in the system, or they force us to develop language and create culture that does not depend on the system. And I'm for the latter, as you might have guessed, which is why I'm beyond excited about the work that's happening here and everything that we're endeavoring to do and the support that we're trying to garner at the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. Because the people who are a part of the Alliance, not just the organizing team, but our donors, our members, hopefully all of you have become members, all of us, we want to do more than just talk about the problems with education and government. I don't need to be a part of an alliance and have meetings to do that. I can do that at my kitchen table. I could do that on Twitter, wherever. We are doing much more than that. We come from different walks of life. We came to self-directed education from very different journeys, but we want to live our beliefs. We want to live our politics. And we want to do something about what we believe. And we see that children and learning, intentional, liberatory living, essentially, is vital to living out those beliefs. And I wrote something here really small that I can't read. Okay. And we want to empower children to participate in society now and then later from that liberatory space. So me, for example, I know that I can't fix racism. No person of color can fix or solve racism. But what I can do is recognize that my beliefs about people's rights, including my own, are a significant factor in how I define myself, how I identify, and how I treat other people. And I can make sure that my approach to parenting reflects those beliefs too. I can do that. That is within my power. Because otherwise, I risk robbing my daughters and anyone else that I'm in a relationship with of that same sense of personal agency and social responsibility that I believe promotes more confidence and compassion among people in the world. So the same agency that my mother knew wasn't available for her or her babies when we were out in public or sitting in classrooms or when she was sitting in office buildings, we now can get together and be part of offering and demanding, in instances, that agency for each other, which is why it's so important that we're not just doing this in our own little parts of the world, but also finding ways to get together to do that in much more powerful ways. And this, for me, is how social justice and self-directed education are inextricably linked. This is how they intersect. This is how and why we have to champion for the rights of oppressed and wronged people, the way children often are, and we have to figure out how to support and highlight each other. Because it's easy to recognize and even speak up about injustice, even if just to your friends, when it's happening out there. But what about the ways that we participate in oppression? What about the ways that we commit human rights violations that are a little bit easier on the eye and a little simpler to tune out? What about the ways that we force children to fit what we need with little regard for what they might actually need? What types of childhoods are our children surviving? And what type of adult people with access to weapons and voting rights and technology are we contributing to the world? These are the questions we need to pose and be willing to get super uncomfortable in dialogue together. That needs to happen, and I feel like those sort of things are happening in spaces like this. We can't avoid discomfort. So these are the questions that self-directed education allows us to shift our energies towards. We learn language and develop practice for trusting people and for learning how to trust ourselves as well. And someone alluded to that the other day, that self-trust. And we have to support parents who are exploring ways to live the notion of liberation in action, starting in their own homes and communities too. Because there's no one clear path to liberation. It must be explored and refined and applied, and we have to pivot. You know, it's a journey, it's a process. And we can't wait for permission from schools and systems to treat our children better. So, thank you. So I shared all of that because I wanted to draw some parallels. I wanted to loop in some often unlooped strings that connect our egos to our children. And I also shared because I aspire to leave any space that I'm a part of a little disheveled from uncomfortable but potentially liberating discussion and thought, and I'm really good at it. I invited Miss Lou's energy into our space because she was a master deschooler, a master decolonizer, and we can do that sort of work in our homes and in our shared learning spaces too, because language is power, and language creation, patois co-creation, is how we can learn to live our politics. That's how we can learn to treat people and raise people in alignment with the type of world that people like you and I dream about and work and organize and live towards. So we have to develop our own patois. We have to listen to children, and we have to factor in the reality of human psychology, how we actually learn, and we have to make space for and participate in people-centered collectives. And it's going to take all of us, including and especially children, in order to live free. We must decide to empower, not mold or coerce our children. And if we look to them to build upon that liberation and that justice-rooted strategy we employ in our lifetime, if we look to them and collaborate with them, we can make it happen. Because at some point, fear-based action has to be overthrown by radical, simple, mindful steps towards our own freedom. This is how we figure out what to do to create new norms based on the type of people that we want to see in the world, instead of just focusing on surviving. Somehow, we still have to figure out how to thrive. We have to move from that survivalist mindset and figure out how to thrive. And for me, making space for children to understand themselves, to define themselves, and to celebrate what feels good for them without devaluing other people's right to do the same thing is how we bring that power and practice into this liberatory work that is self-directed education. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.